Attila the Hun. The man who had extracted tribute from both the Eastern and Western Roman empires simultaneously, who had left the plain outside the destroyed city of Naissus so thick with bones that Roman envoys reported it decades later, who had made his name so synonymous with annihilation that entire regions surrendered without a fight, simply because they had heard what happened to the ones that resisted, died in his own bed on his own wedding night, choking on a nosebleed. The historian Priscus, who had actually dined with Attila as part of a Roman diplomatic mission and left the only surviving eyewitness account of the man, recorded the death with the flat specificity of someone who found the whole thing genuinely strange. In 453 AD, Attila married a young Germanic woman named Ildico, his latest wife in a long succession of them, and held the kind of celebration that a man who had just arranged the largest wedding feast the Hunnic world could produce would hold. He drank heavily. He retired to the bridal chamber. He did not emerge. The Gothic monk Jordanes, writing later in the 6th century, preserved the account that the guards grew nervous when morning passed and the tent remained sealed. They broke down the door and found Attila lying in his own blood with no wound, and his new bride weeping in a corner, too terrified to cry out. What had killed the scourge of God was not a Roman army, not a conspiracy of nobles, not any of the enemies he had spent his life making. He had suffered a hemorrhage, almost certainly from a nosebleed aggravated by alcohol, and lying on his back in a stupor, had choked on the blood that could not find its ordinary passage. The most feared military commander of the age had been undone by the physiology of a common nosebleed. The theories multiplied immediately, as they always do when the powerful die under ambiguous circumstances. Some ancient sources accused Ildico directly, suggesting she had stabbed him on behalf of some enemy, a version that found its way into Norse sagas centuries later. Others suspected Byzantine poisoners who had every reason to want him dead before he launched the eastern campaign he had been preparing. Modern physicians examining the account have suggested a brain hemorrhage or esophageal varices from chronic heavy drinking as plausible explanations that require no assassination at all. What is certain is how he was buried. His warriors, in an act of mourning that Jordanes described as distinctly Hunnic, gashed their own faces with knives so that the greatest of all warriors would be mourned in blood rather than tears. His body was placed inside 3 coffins, the outermost iron, the middle silver, the innermost gold, representing the triple nature of the empire he had taken. The burial site was prepared in secret, at night, in a riverbed, his men diverted and then restored so that water would cover whatever mark the grave had left. Every person who participated in the burial was killed afterward to prevent the location from being disclosed. The grave has never been found. A man who made his life's work the removal of other people's futures left the world in the most complete possible way, taking the location of his own remains with him into an anonymity that has lasted 1,500 years and counting. Caligula. He had spent the final years of his reign in a state of escalating contempt for everyone around him that reads, through the ancient sources, as almost deliberately designed to engineer his own murder. He insulted his senators publicly and systematically. He had men who displeased him, forced to watch their sons executed. He mocked the officer of his own bodyguard so relentlessly, so personally, so specifically about the man's voice and masculinity, that the officer in question began planning an assassination not as a political act, but as a response to a grievance that had become impossible to contain. That officer was Cassius Chaerea, a Praetorian tribune who had survived the Teutoburg Forest massacre in 9 AD, one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Roman history, and who had spent decades building a reputation as a soldier of uncommon courage. Caligula assigned him humiliating watchwords, used his name as a punchline, and apparently never once considered that a man who had already survived things far worse than an emperor's scorn might eventually stop tolerating it. On January 24th, 41 CE, Caligula attended the Palatine Games, a series of theatrical performances and athletic events he was apparently enjoying thoroughly. After the performances, he walked through an underground corridor connecting the theater to his private quarters, a narrow passage that his usual German bodyguards could not effectively cover all at once. Chaerea was waiting. By the account of Suetonius, who drew on sources writing within living memory of the event, Chaerea struck first, a sword blow to the shoulder, and then the corridor became chaos, other conspirators rushing in from the darkness, and Caligula went down on his knees, and then down entirely, as approximately 30 wounds were opened in his body before the last blow landed. He was 28 years old. He had been emperor for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. His wife Caesonia and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla were killed the same day. The child was 2 years old. According to the grim specifics preserved in the ancient account, Her head was shattered against a wall by one of the conspirators, a detail so extreme that it has struck readers across 2,000 years as almost unnecessary in its completeness, which is perhaps why it was recorded. The conspirators believed they were ending a lineage, not just a reign. What they could not control was the Praetorian Guard's institutional interest in the survival of the imperial system. The Senate had briefly, somewhat desperately hoped that Caligula's murder might be the occasion to restore the Republic. The Guard had a different opinion, and within hours they found Claudius, Caligula's stammering, overlooked uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, and proclaimed him emperor instead. Chaerea himself was condemned to death by the new emperor, not for the murder but for the broader disorder it represented. He reportedly asked to be executed with his own personal sword, and the request was granted. The man who ended Caligula's reign did not outlast it by much. Qin Shi Huang. The man who had unified China, standardized its language and currency and weights and measures, built the backbone of what would become the Great Wall, ordered the burning of philosophical texts he found threatening, and had an army of 8,000 individually detailed terracotta soldiers constructed to guard him in the afterlife, spent the last decade of his life in an increasingly desperate war against the one enemy he could not conquer. He was terrified of death, not in the way that most people are quietly and vaguely afraid of dying, but in a way that shaped his entire administration. The way a phobia shapes a personality, structurally, comprehensively, distorting everything it touched. He sent expeditions across the sea, possibly reaching Japan, in search of mythical islands where immortal sages were said to possess the secret of eternal life. He employed a growing court of alchemists who competed with each other to produce compounds they promised would extend his reign indefinitely. He slept in a different room every night, keeping his location secret on pain of death, surrounded by elevated walkways and covered corridors designed to ensure that no enemy could track his movements. He survived multiple assassination attempts, including a famous one by the swordsman Jing Ke in 227 BCE, and each attempt seems to have compounded a paranoia that was already comprehensive. The alchemists gave him mercury. They gave it to him in the form of pills, calling it the essence of immortality, and according to the soil analysis of his tomb complex at Mount Li near modern Xi'an, which has confirmed extraordinary levels of mercury in the burial mound, this was not a minor supplement. Archaeological and chemical evidence strongly suggests he was consuming mercury compounds regularly and in significant quantities for years. Modern medicine understands mercury poisoning well enough to recognize what would have been happening to him: tremors, cognitive deterioration, increasing paranoia, erratic behavior. The symptoms that historians and ancient sources describe in his later years are consistent with chronic heavy metal neurotoxicity. The treatment meant to keep him alive was systematically destroying his brain while he took it. He died in 210 BCE while traveling on a tour of the eastern provinces, far from his capital, at a place called Shakyu. He was 49 years old. His chief minister Li Si and the court eunuch Zhao Gao were present at the death, and they made the decision, immediately and cold-bloodedly, to conceal it. The emperor's body was loaded into his sealed carriage and the tour continued, with carts of rotting fish arranged around it to cover the smell, as the body decomposed in the summer heat over the weeks it took to return to the capital. Only when they had maneuvered a compliant successor into position and secured their own positions did they announce that the first emperor of China was dead. The dynasty he had spent his life building outlasted him by 4 years. His son was manipulated off the throne and then into suicide. The Qin state was torn apart by rebellion within a decade of his death. The terracotta army still stands in the dry Shaanxi earth, guarding an emperor whose fear of death produced an immortality of the most ironic kind. He is remembered primarily because of the monument he built to his own terror, and the substance that was supposed to keep him alive forever was almost certainly what killed him: Vlad III. He had impaled somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people during his reign as Prince of Wallachia, a range so wide that it illustrates not the imprecision of the historians but the scale of the practice. He had done this so enthusiastically and at such scale that the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, a man who had conquered Constantinople and was not given to squeamishness, reportedly turned back his invasion of Wallachia in 1462. Upon encountering the forest of 20,000 impaled bodies, Vlad had arranged outside his capital as a deterrent. He had been captured by the Hungarians in 1462, imprisoned for 12 years, converted to Catholicism, married a Hungarian noblewoman, regained his throne in 1476 with Hungarian military support, and then died within weeks of retaking power. The exact circumstances of his death in late 1476 or early 1477 are, in the way of many violent men who made many enemies, genuinely unclear. He may have been killed in battle against the Ottomans. He may have been assassinated by Wallachian boyars who found his methods excessive even by the standards of the time. One account suggests he was killed by his own men by accident, mistaken for an Ottoman soldier while disguised during a battle reconnaissance. What is certain is that his head ended up in Constantinople, sent there by whoever killed him as proof of death for the Ottoman court, and displayed on a spike for some time. He had made himself so terrifying that even this final evidence of his mortality had to be publicly confirmed and displayed. Bram Stoker gave his name to a vampire in 1897. The fiction has always been considerably less strange than the fact. Ivan the Terrible. He had killed his own heir. That is the fact that the last years of Ivan IV's reign circle around, the fixed point from which everything else in his final decade radiates outward. In November 1581, in a private chamber in the Alexandrovskaya Sloboda Palace complex, he had beaten his son and designated heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with an iron-tipped staff during an argument that had begun when he objected to his daughter-in-law's dress. His son intervened to defend his wife. Ivan struck him. The blow was fatal. The Tsarevich died 4 days later. Ilya Repin's 1885 painting of the moment, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, shows the elder Ivan cradling his son's bleeding head with an expression that 19th century viewers recognized immediately as a specific kind of horror. The horror of a man holding the consequence of something he cannot undo. It is one of the most psychologically accurate paintings of an historical event ever made, and the response it provoked in Imperial Russia was so disturbing that Tsar Alexander III had it removed from public view temporarily after spectators were reported to slash the canvas. Ivan spent the remaining 3 years of his life in documented religious terror and deteriorating health. The dynasty he had spent his life building had destroyed itself with his own hands in one moment of ordinary domestic fury. He turned increasingly to witches and soothsayers, filling his court with prognosticators who promised to stabilize a future that was already structurally broken. One prophecy, reliably recorded in contemporary sources, told him he would die on the 18th of March 1584. When the day arrived, he apparently called for his soothsayers and, when the date passed without incident as the morning progressed, reportedly threatened to have them executed for false prophecy. They told him the day was not yet over. He died that same day, while playing chess with his companion Bogdan Belsky. The official account is a stroke. What sits beneath the official account is more complicated. There is a tradition, recorded in later sources, suggesting that Belsky and Boris Godunov, who had been present in the palace in the days immediately preceding, may have poisoned or strangled the Tsar after he attempted to assault Godunov's sister, and both men realized they had become mortal threats to themselves. The mercury found in Ivan's exhumed remains, which forensic analysis has confirmed at levels far above normal, has been attributed variously to treatment for syphilis or to deliberate poisoning, and the question has not been resolved. What he left behind was a throne occupied by his surviving son Fyodor, who was by virtually every contemporary account intellectually incapable of governing. The Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russia since the 9th century, effectively ended with Ivan's death, completing itself in a childless and incompetent reign that gave way to the catastrophic time of troubles. He had spent his life creating a centralized, terror-driven autocracy, and he had then personally destroyed its future with a single blow of a staff in a private room. Genghis Khan. He had ordered that upon his death should be kept secret. This was not vanity or sentimentality, it was operational intelligence. The campaigns he was conducting at the time of his dying required his enemies to not know they could stop being afraid of him until it was too late to matter. And so, the funeral procession that carried his body back across the Mongolian steppe from the Western Shia campaign in 1227 moved under conditions of enforced silence, and according to the accounts that have come down through the sources, everyone who encountered or witnessed the procession was killed. This was a man who, even in death, was still running a military operation. Even dying, he gave orders that resulted in more deaths, including his final command that the Western Shia people, whose territory he was in the process of conquering when illness took him, should be wiped from the face of the earth. His heirs carried out the order. They leveled cities. They killed or enslaved the population. The Tangut civilization that had persisted in northwestern China for over 2 centuries was effectively erased from history within years of the Khan's death, the final campaign of a general who was already dead when it was completed. The cause of his death at approximately 65 years old in August 1227 remains genuinely contested across the historical sources in ways that cannot be resolved. The secret history of the Mongols, The closest thing to a contemporary Mongol account that survives describes a fall from his horse during a winter hunt in 1226 and a subsequent fever that he never fully recovered from. Marco Polo, writing decades later, claimed an arrow wound to the knee during the final Western Xia campaign became infected and killed him. A Persian chronicle suggests plague. A Mongolian legend, the most dramatic and therefore probably the least reliable, claims that a captive princess of the Western Xia killed him through a concealed weapon during a forced encounter, a story that has the particular quality of a narrative invented to explain a death that the official sources were not willing to clearly describe. Modern researchers, examining the symptoms described across the various sources, have proposed bubonic plague as a possibility, noting that the disease was present in the region and that the symptom profile of sudden fever, rapid decline, and death within days is consistent with what the sources describe. The truth, whatever it was deliberately obscured by the Mongol court that had every reason to control the narrative around their founder's death. His burial site remains unknown. His successors took the secrecy of the location as seriously as everything else he had commanded. The stories say the ground was stamped flat by horses, that trees were planted over the site, that a river was diverted to cover it. No confirmed archaeological discovery of his tomb has ever been made. The man who depopulated entire regions, whose campaigns left measurable demographic craters visible in the climate record as abandoned farmland, returned to forest and absorbed carbon from the atmosphere, left no recoverable physical trace. He is present everywhere and nowhere at once, which is perhaps the most Genghis Khan ending possible. Herod the Great. He had executed 3 of his sons. He had executed his wife, the Hasmonean princess Mariamne, whom the historian Josephus describes as genuinely beloved by him, and whom he spent years afterward haunting with her name, calling for servants to summon her as if he had forgotten she was dead. He had reportedly ordered that when he died, prominent Jewish leaders should be executed so that there would be mourning across Judea, whether the people chose to mourn him or not. He was a man who had ruled for 33 years by making the world afraid of him, and in his final months, the world was watching him die and finding that it was not particularly afraid after all. The condition Josephus describes in his Jewish Antiquities is one of the most clinical and physically detailed accounts of a dying ruler in ancient historical writing. Herod suffered from an agonizing progression that modern physicians have variously diagnosed as chronic kidney disease, gangrene of the genitals, intestinal inflammation, worms, convulsions, and difficulty breathing, a collection of symptoms that have led some medical historians to suggest a condition called Fournier's gangrene, complicated by a secondary infection. Whatever the specific diagnosis, the picture Josephus paints is of a man whose body was consuming itself from the inside in conditions of escalating horror, while the political world around him continued its maneuvering as if he were already gone. He died in 4 BCE, just 5 days after ordering the execution of his son Antipater, whom he had implicated in a final plot against him from his deathbed. He died in his palace at Jericho. The order he had given to execute the Jewish leaders upon his death was not carried out. The people he had hoped to force into mourning felt, apparently, no particular grief. Augustus, upon hearing of the execution of Antipater, made a remark that has been transmitted through the 5th century writer Macrobius, and that captures in a single pun the historical judgment on Herod's parenthood. It was better, he reportedly said, to be Herod's pig than his son. The joke turned on the Greek words for the 2 animals, and on the fact that Jewish dietary law protected pigs from the royal table in a way that Herod's own children demonstrably were not. Whether Augustus actually said it is uncertain. That it became the enduring summary of Herod's reign is not. Kim Il-sung. He built a system specifically designed to outlast him. That is the thing about Kim Il-sung that separates him from most of the rulers on this list, in terms of legacy, if not necessarily in terms of the scale of direct suffering he caused. The others built empires, dynasties, terror apparatus, organizational structures that collapsed or transformed or eventually became something different from what their founders intended. Kim built a machine for the reproduction of exactly itself, a state that transferred his personality cult intact from himself to his son and then to his grandson, without the interruption that succession almost always creates in authoritarian systems. He died in July 1994 of a heart attack at the age of 82. His death was announced to the North Korean people on July 9th, 2 days after it occurred, in a manner that was choreographed with the same careful attention to symbolic presentation that had characterized every aspect of his public existence. The mourning that followed was both genuine and coerced simultaneously, performed by a population that had spent decades under a system that treated the failure to perform grief with sufficient conviction as a reportable offense, and that had been so comprehensively cut off from any outside frame of reference that many people within the country had no way to emotionally process the event except through the terms the system itself had provided. What he left behind was a state that a 2014 United Nations Commission of Inquiry described as having committed crimes against humanity on a scale and with a persistence for which there was no modern parallel. The Quanliso prison camp system he had established imprisoned entire family units for the political offenses of one member. A man's grandchildren could be born into a labor camp for a crime their grandfather committed before they existed. The Korean War he had launched in 1950, which killed approximately 3 million people, ended in an armistice that left the peninsula exactly where it had started, a result he had delivered at catastrophic cost and achieved nothing. He died of natural causes, in his own bed, in a country that was entirely his. His son took the throne. His grandson holds it now. The system continues. It is perhaps the most genuinely terrifying ending on this list, not because of how he died, but because of what his dying changed. Almost nothing.